archetypes wheel. And just for as a quick recap for those who've never seen these videos, if you're landing on this first time, we're going through this incredibly complicated looking drawing, which is just a coloring mandala for self-reflection, where we basically unpack one line at a time on these, what we call these archetype paths, like paths of 3 different archetypes that people can embody in their life choicefully if they're designing their life anew, changing careers, thinking about their next steps in life. And we unpack them based on the coloring system. We just open up a little bit more: yin archetype, yang archetype, mastery, and then the practice that you can use to make that life path accelerate. And that's the format we've been using already for a few weeks now. And today, Jonas, I thought we could tackle the path of sexuality, which has at the end of it the tantra, which is a big topic, since at the moment I'm doing a streaming session with Gitte, who's also talking about that with the topics of masculinity, femininity, conscious harmony between genders. So it's like at the moment it seems to be a topic that's a bit of a hot topic in our men's group as well. So if you're game for that, we could actually jump into this topic today.
Yeah, it sounds good. I think it's an important topic. Again, it's one of those that most of us will not translate that into a professional occupation activity. Most of us don't get paid for our sexual lives or for using our sexual energy. Although, when it comes to sexual energy, that's something you can actually translate indirectly into work. But it's one of those that's interesting because we all have sexual energy inside of us, and it comes across in different ways. And often these topics also bring up the topics of gender and gender identity, and there's a lot of confusion between masculine and feminine and the yin and yang energies and sexuality. So it's quite a big topic to unpack. Obviously today we're probably just going to scratch the surface, but it's probably
Scratch the surface,
yeah, it's probably one of those that's easier to relate to, I think, concretely than some of the other archetypes that we've done that might have been a little bit more abstract for some people.
And just to frame the process of what we're doing, is the idea of this archetype wheel is to color it in with 3 colors. If you ever actually want to try that yourself, you can download it here. And the idea is that you take 1 color for the archetypes that you've embodied in the past, 1 color for the archetypes that you're currently embodying, and obviously there's several always, and then 1 color for the future archetypes that you'd like to embody more. And so this idea is really just to help reflect more widely than generally staying on the train track of our career or family or hobby life, and stepping out of that and exploring. It's like some people call it bubble traveling, exploring these different archetypes. So it's a way of just empowering some new ideas and new thinking. And today the topic is therefore going to be the path of sexuality, which is really tricky because it's often very intertwined with gender, as we talked about earlier. So where do we start, Captain?
Well, as usual, we typically enter a pathway mostly in the yin receptive posture. And so maybe we could start by trying to make this concrete. So maybe, Estève, you could help us understand some concrete illustrations of what the yin archetype level of this is. What does it look like typically when people start to embark on that journey? And in practice, what does it mean to be yin when it comes to that path of sexuality?
It was the whole topic of polarity is something that I started looking up in management theory in Western literature, and very quickly I found it was actually more to do with Asian philosophy and tantric practices and polarity of lead and follow dynamics. If we simplify it down to the basic essential, yin in a dynamic of sexuality is, in a way, being in the state of love, being in that experience of love, and the yang would be in the state of freedom. Traditionally, people associate the yin with the feminine, which is a huge mistake, because then it creates this idea that only feminine and people who identify as a woman would be able to experience receiving in that yin state. But yingness is basically receiving. It's inner focus. It is about first focusing on oneself, getting oneself up to scratch. And so the archetype here is about seducing. It's about being seen, whether it's from a masculine perspective of being in the virility, and the feminine perspective, femininity. And of course, if you're non-binary, then you would have another word which is like attract chemistry, for example. But focusing on being attractive in this case is what the yin is about, and that's like really abstract. So you can see there's four pictures, like four little people around the person who symbolizes a heart. If I zoom in a bit more, it's like the details here matter. So you got this heart-like person who's being the object of love in the yin sense, and there's four different polarities around that can be attracted to that. There is the masculine yang, the masculine yin, the feminine yang, and the feminine yin. So in Asia, they would talk about the canine being the masculine and the feline being the feminine. So each of those four is basically being a seducer to any four of those different other people around. So to embody that archetype, somebody who's colorating in, you could say, once you've felt what it's like to be attractive, seducer to all of those four polarities, then you've fully embodied that archetype. Is that too abstract, Jonas?
No, I think just to build on top of that, if we maybe relate it back to our personal experiences to make it tangible, I think in the beginning it's a yin energy because it's not something you go out and seek, it's something that happens to you, right? You fall in love, you get that crush on that cute girl in your class when you're in school, and you have all these feelings that get confused and bundled together, and typically that's the first thing that we encounter is these strong feelings, a combination of different things. If we look at it, there's the notion of attraction, right? Because you can be physically attracted to someone, for example, which is mostly I guess, the erotic side of attraction. Then you're going to have the strong loves, but friendships as well. And you might have some friendships in terms of those energies that can turn into something that is deeper or that then becomes more erotic. Or inversely, you can have the crush on the cheerleader of the class archetype, the hot one, and then fall out of attraction once you actually get to know her, once you see that, she happens to be an empty shell, for example, if we have to go for the massive cliches. Not to say that cheerleaders are empty shells, but I think we can all think of that hot girl in high school that maybe wasn't the deepest river, so to speak. So there are a few things that might be interesting to just define and clarify as well at this level. Maybe we could talk about the types of love, because that's an important way to kind of look and measure attraction. So maybe, Estève, you could give us a bit of a breakdown on that. And then we could also look at the concept of love languages, attachment styles, and the key emotions that happen in this stage, and some of the key differences between typically how sexuality from the masculine perspective typically happens. I'm thinking back to some conversations that we had, Estève, about frustration and fantasy. For example, how as a teenager, typically, I think for a lot of guys that's the case, one of the main things that you experience related to sexuality is frustration, because you have that strong appetite, but you don't have the same opportunity. It's not the same being, even if you're part of the popular crowd, it's typically not as straightforward and easy for men to have access to that sexual sphere, and there's often a lot of pressure and drama associated to that for women as well, but typically in a slightly different way. So maybe to start unpacking some of that, maybe the types of love would be interesting to go into, or what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking, like, basically, if we look at it from the first archetype, it's generally what people want to be in social media. They want to be seen as attractive, and that archetype is about being seen as attractive, first within your own eyes. Like, do you actually like yourself? Are you at peace with yourself, whatever the gender? And then the second one is where you start looking at the types of love, the 8 types of connection that Jonas was referring to. I think this is where we talk about love languages. This is where we talk about the playgrounds of cultivating desire on multiple different levels of connection. What do you call love languages? But because you mentioned that also, Jonas.
Yeah, it's this idea that people express and receive love in different currencies, essentially. I think you've got acts of service, words of affirmation, spending time together. What else do you have? You can look it up online. I'm not. They're not all coming back to me right now. But physical touch. That's another one. In practice, some people don't care if you tell them that you love them. Like, it literally doesn't make them feel warm and fuzzy inside.
Mm-mm.
And other people don't feel loved when they're being touched, hugged, for example, in that way. So the idea is that we have love languages. We have ways in which we typically express our positive feelings, and ways in which we actually appreciate receiving as well. Something that makes us feel loved, not just intellectually knowing, this person cares about me, but that actually feels good to receive. So yeah, spending time together, presence, expressing words of affirmation, physical touch. And yeah, there's that. There's always one. Whenever there's a list of five or something,
It's always interesting to
as
see which
the
one it is that we forget. It's like usually
yep,
that. But if we go back to the first archetype being the seducer, and this can be anybody, any gender, like in a sense, to fully embody that is quite rare, because if you take those four different quadrants around it, to really embody being the seducer in that sense, and I don't mean a negative seducer, I mean in the sense just being the object of desire, being the person who is seen as desirable. From four different perspectives, it's quite rare. You have if you think of the Asian breakdown of the four types of polarity with masculine, feminine, yin and yang together. Like if you can all think of the sort of canine, the dog, as the yang archetype of the dog would be the wolf. So it doesn't matter what gender they are, somebody can be in that sort of energy of masculine and freedom oriented, and the yang of that is the wolf, the yin is the dog. So have you embodied the seducer being desired by the wolf, by the dog, and also from the feminine side by the cat, which is the feminine yin, and by the tiger, which is the feminine yang? It gets quite complicated. That's why people revert back to gender. It's much simpler, but it's less accurate in actually what's going on, because we've all met people who are very masculine as women and very feminine as men, and their polarity can be both yin and yang. So it's not actually a black and white gradient of gender. There's something very
right.
interesting about the sexual tension right there that can be explored in that archetype of the seducer.
Mm. So in what ways have you embodied the first archetype, Estève,
Well,
concretely?
when I think back to my own teenage years, I was definitely not the sexy guy. You know, I was not the attractive kid. I was a bit more the geeky, philosophical guy. And I was actually gendered as a kid. When I had longer hair, it was blonde at the time. I was always treated I was like, oh, la petite fille, the girl, right? So as a kid, I was gendered as a girl. I was basically mocked for having long hair, and I didn't look in the archetypal masculine of the days. So I was more easily experiencing being attractive from the feminine, but who were the cats. So let's say the archetypal feminine were the ones I would hang out and talk philosophy with them. That would be like my first experience of being the seducer. Is that my best pickup would be not talking about myself, but basically talking about spirituality and ghost stories and things like that. I felt like I was in that role. I was experiencing being attractive because I was talking about things that they were interested in. Later on, I discovered the whole field of Tantra and pickup artistry and explored a bit of that, and found that there's multiple ways that one can be seen as attractive and enjoy that attention and use it in a way that is kind. So, but I've not yet embodied all those aspects of that archetype, but it's one of the ones I'm really interested in terms of how does that happen without being disrespectful in a particular culture. So this whole topic of
Yeah.
where is the consent, where this is like, for me, it's current investigation. Is that your therapy notes, writing down, going like, okay, now note to self, this is what we need to talk about in therapy next. But yeah, that's basically the experience I've had so far. What about you?
Well, I think for me, it was I definitely didn't feel attractive until very late in life. I still don't consider myself to be very attractive, even. And it's funny. I was when I was hearing you talk, I was asking myself, like, how does one get to find themselves attractive? Because a lot of this putting out that energy and seducing, to some degree, requires you believing what you're selling, right? You need to have that confidence. You need to have some degree of appreciation of yourself in order to let people appreciate you. So I think for me, like, very cliche experience in my teenage years, I was very much the dog in terms of those four classifications. So I was more the nice guy that was trying to seduce by being friendly and accidentally killing any sexual tension. So I was really good friends with a lot of beautiful girls, and I had access to all of their like lives and drama and deepest secrets and all of that, but I just didn't get to do anything fun with that information. So for me, it was in the beginning. It was yeah, quite frustrating from that perspective. Uh, and then I got to understand, and for me, I think it switched when I switched how I was looking at myself as well, and moving away from trying to seduce to actually just trying to do whatever really made me genuine and authentic, and in a way probably put out a different energy. And it's when I started basically doing what I really wanted and not trying to convince or trying to seduce that I had a shift in my experiences. And also another big shift for me was um, not choosing, basically realizing that I was not the one choosing. I was being chosen, and I had to choose the ones that were choosing me instead of trying to convince a girl that had absolutely no interest in me that I was worth considering. Like that, the amount of time and energy I have wasted in my young years, just yeah, basically not understanding that whole dynamic of choosing and being chosen, and not understanding in a way what made me valuable on the market. You know, you're a teenage boy, and you think to yourself that you have to be cool, and you have to be funny, and you have to be nice, and you have to be edgy, and you have to be all of those things. But in practice, what you have to be most is probably just yourself, and shine in one way, like do something that really makes you come across as yeah, special in a way, and that's the only thing that really needs to happen and matter. But yeah, I was wondering, to throw a question back at you, how do you think, like how was what is it that makes you feel seductive or attractive? Like, what are the experiences, whether it's in the relationship to yourself or the relationship with other people, what has helped you to build that strong baseline of just confidence and peace, essentially?
Yeah, it's a really good question. If I had a ready-made silver bullet answer, I'd probably be rich. But an element to that is definitely the relationship to self. Because if I'm doubting myself, if I'm constantly challenging myself in my head that I'm not good enough, that I'm talking about performance in my head, like, you know, being a good enough person or friend or lover, you know, and self-judgment in my inner narrative, uh, generally it goes down to not being very feeling attractive at all. But the minute I start to actually just make peace with whatever quirkiness I might have, you know, the long hair as a child or wearing weird Viking clothes as an adult, you know, whatever it is that makes it different, to not choose to see that as a problem, but to start to basically use humor on oneself and to laugh at oneself and to be at peace with oneself, uh, tends to relax the body language. And then it kind of, perhaps there's a very physiological effect that creates more attractiveness to, that, you know, when somebody is smiling and at peace with themselves, they're generally more attractive when they're deeply tormented and frowning all the time and being triggered by everything. So for me, that's like, I would say a condition is being able to be at peace with oneself. And I think the second archetype is where it goes towards then looking outside. I think the inner is the first archetype. Like, the first archetype is a lot to do with inner narrative and inner voices and self-image and ego, whereas the second one is a lot more to do with connection, as the picture shows, with the two people with the heart in between them. The heart is no longer me. The heart is the connection between the two, which can be cultivated like a garden. So that one, I would say, is the condition. It's a constant practice to be able to turn up in that archetype of the lover, where the focus is not just on myself being good enough or attractive enough, but actually turning up and holding in space to connect with another. So
I
maybe
think,
that go.
yeah, just to build, just to finish on the last archetype, I think another thing that really helps as well for that baseline of confidence um, and mastery of the first level is giving a positive meaning to not being attractive and being rejected, because it's like in many other areas of life, right? It's, we know that we can't be everyone's cup of tea. So there
Mm.
have to be times where necessarily we face rejection, or the experience of not being attracted, or the experience of being stereotyped negatively, even being rejected. And that has to be okay as well. And being at
Mm.
peace with that helps, I think, to accept who we are. And also in that relationship to oneself, you don't need to see yourself as perfect. You don't need to convince yourself that you're Beyonce or Brad Pitt to feel at peace with yourself and to feel attractive. Um, but you have to probably understand in what ways you can be seductive. You don't have to be perfect in every way, but there are
Mm.
probably some things like, okay, for some people it's going to be more their spirit, their personality. Other people definitely their looks. But it's, I think it does require being at peace with rejection in and the experience of not being attractive as well. Like, it's the law of opposites, right?
You used the word meaning. It just popped in my mind, the whole logotherapy of like the importance of reprogramming the meaning that you give to your own rejection, for example, or
Mm.
being attractive or not attractive. Either way, the meaning one gives to it is kind of like, I think, hugely important in experiencing that archetype.
And I think one of the issues that we have around this topic at the moment is that there's a lot of outrage and conversation about fixing the outside, fixing the norms, fixing the rules, fixing the discourse, the language. But there's very little focus on fixing the internal narratives related to all
Mm.
these things. And I think there are a lot of that there's a risk that some of these confusions between gender and sexuality and polarity lead to people fixing the wrong problem and not actually feeling better about themselves. So it's one of those areas where I would heavily recommend starting fixing within before we try and change something on the outside, because
Mm.
that can bring that a lot of that positive experience which people seek, which is just feeling comfortable, feeling at peace, and just feeling safe. And I think, yeah, there's a tendency in our day and age to focus too much on the outside as if that was going to fix the whole problem. But I think we
Mm.
can have perfect language and still some of these problems will occur if we're not working on those internal relationships as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's a huge topic we can open up there, like, and relationship to self, obviously not just because of your therapy hat, but I think just as a general basic human hygiene, like the topics we've been opening up with Gita around gender and polarity and even sexuality, is that one of our conclusions is that actually a lot of this is just mind games that we play based on prejudice and stereotype on gender roles, when in fact they're fundamentally human issues of, am I attracted, am I attractive, am I in connection? Am I getting loved? You know, those very fundamental
Yeah.
human questions are deeper than the gendering or the sexuality. But in this case, the sexuality is where we play with particular types of connection, where the keyword desire, what often people call chemistry, is sort of present.
Mm. So how to make this concrete again, how would you embody, or how have you seen that lover archetype embodied in the positive and maybe in the less positive?
Well, let's say if the seducer is the internal focus, look at me. The lover is the external focus. Let's look at the connection. As you said earlier, there's like multiple levels of connection. If we take the Greek ways of talking about connection, which are very connected to the chakra system used in Tantra, which is why I like it, is that there's 8 different levels, because one of them, the heart, has got 2 parts. There's the inner connection to self, philautia, and the connection to friendship, others, which is philia. And I think what I love about the way of the Greeks of talking about this is that before you can love anybody else, you need to have the philautia. So the philautia is like the first one, love yourself. The second one is all the other 7 types of connection, long-term love. So a very concrete example of that is, of course, they're all centered around the connection of eros, if we're talking about sexuality, which is the second chakra. And in that eros, you can connect by being physically present, but you can also, often the time, is that the lover archetype can also just be the mind, the game that you play on sexting or phone or Skypes or Zooms, and just being present at a distance to that desire and cultivating the desire. So rather consuming the desire and using it as a self reassuring. Like in the seducer role, it's more like the desire is a proof that I've succeeded, whereas in the lover, it's something that I cultivate and want to keep sort of alive and play with like a gardener. So concretely, yeah, that means being in a relationship where there is a certain amount of intimacy, where you can actually have sex and you can talk about your desires, not just act on them. So, stepping into, like, the good way would be to be able to actually voice a desire, play with it, tease the other person, even maybe, go and execute that fantasy. And then, that's what the dark side of it would be, literally embodying somebody who's watched a lot of porn, for example, who basically doesn't talk about anything, but their head is full of images, full of fantasies that are very unrealistic. And then they're basically in their own desire, trapped in their own minds, wanting to see the fantasy on the outside play out as they have it in their head without speaking it because it feels awkward. So that's the dark side of the lover, is being trapped in one's own head and one's own imaginary desire playground, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the pitfalls, is becoming just a dopamine junkie. And when you look at the technological solutions for meeting people quickly nowadays, it is probably easier than ever before in history to just have plenty of casual encounters with people in order to just hit that dopamine switch and just try to get that feeling of validation. And what I see a lot in therapy is that a lot of people that have those type of relationships actually end up feeling more alone and feeling worse about themselves than people who even have fewer relationships. Not to say that in itself it's not a good thing to have plenty of casual sex with strangers. I think there are conditions where that can be a very fulfilling and rich experience. But generally, you need that framing, and again, you need the meaning, and it needs to happen in a certain way to not just be objectifying other people and objectifying yourself, and actually lacking other levels of connection and purely just having the physiological side, which is why I like the 8 types of, like, the Greek types of love, because it gives us a deeper understanding of how connection can happen. So, little exercise I often give in couples therapy, or when it's relevant in individual like therapy, is basically drawing a pie chart with the types of connection that you have in that relationship. So, pragma would be the one, the love of reason. The how connected are you mentally with the person? Um, Ludus is how playful, like how well do you connect child to child, so to speak. You have the philia, which you mentioned, that like connection that is like a friendship or family love. You have the agape, more like the spiritual love, the yeah, I guess the spiritual connection that you have with that person. Obviously, the eros, the physiological sexual connection you have with someone. And what you can see is when you draw out the proportion for each relationship, you can really see how those relationships feel different. And even though we all have a baseline of needs, every single one of our relationships throughout our lives is going to be a slightly different looking pie chart. And that relationship evolves over time as well. So a little exercise that you can do if you want to go deeper on that is to use those types of love and kind of quantify them in each specific relationship that you find interesting to examine. But yeah, I think to on this level, at the more proactive side, if I'm thinking about practices that help to enrich and help to move to the last level of mastery, um, to me, a lot of this comes down to how able are we to communicate clearly and to make all those implicit things actually explicit and have the courage to have those conversations. I think that's something that you have taught me as well. Is in practice how necessarily uncomfortable we have to be willing to be in order to have access to how satisfying and truly rewarding that experience and realm of life can be. So I'm wondering, like, do you have any concrete examples or things to share about how you've made those scripts, all of those implicit things in the game, how you've made those more explicit and conscious in order to be able to go and play in some of these bubbles?
Well, obviously, one of them is sort of separating them out and acknowledging that you can have them in different combination, like harmonies on a guitar string. Like if you think of, you can play everything on one string, which is eros, but then you can also combine them and have, for example, pragma and eros together is usually what people call sapiosexuality, where somebody gets turned on by being around somebody who's really smart, like their professor or whatever. Or you can take mania and eros, which is a very common combination where somebody gets obsessively into the sexual thing and it becomes obsessive eros. Or then you get philia and eros, which is like fuck buddies. Sorry, did I say, and then you have so many different combinations possible, which opens the playground of cultivating desire. Desire is not only eros. Desire can be a combination of agape, for example, and eros is what red tantra is all about. It's about like connecting to the beauty of another person in the spiritual sense as well as their personality sense, with the erotic tension at the same time. It's very old practice. So they all can, you can start picking out all those different levels of connection and cultivating them as a way of basically cultivating desire in that archetype of the lover. So I could just go on and on about this, but I'm not sure how tangible you want us to go there on this kind of stream, Jonas.
Well, I'm just thinking really again, like some of this has to be made explicit, right? What do we expect from each other? What do we actually want? What actually makes us feel good? What are we aiming for? Is this a short-term thing? Are we going to see if we want to build something more? Is this a monogamous thing? Is this not? Like, I'm just thinking, do you have any anecdotes about having to draft up some of those relationship agreements?
Yeah, I think that's the key word, is that basically it doesn't matter what you do to cultivate the desire and those types of connection. Is that what I started to find with Anu when we were because we're in a committed conscious relation where we actually have a relationship agreement that we update, is that very few people do that. I know a couple of lawyers who are very intent on agreements of all kinds, so they have legal relationship agreements. But a couple of therapy friends who do talk about their relationship agreement, but very few people, unless they're in some kind of very unusual relation, like sort of open relationship with BDSM or something like that, or swingers. But very few, even in the swinging community, there's very few people who actually take the time to make a relationship agreement of those different types of connection. And well, I don't know what your view as a therapist on this would be, but I would say that it's pretty fundamental to be able to cultivate desire when it's explicitly agreed and not just assumed, and then resentment builds when the other doesn't read our mind about what we assume.
I think that's a big limiting belief that I see a lot in my clinical practice, is the idea that desire requires spontaneity. So we cannot plan when we have intimacy because that would kill the vibe.
Mm,
But we can plan dates and assume that maybe it's going to happen, and we know there's more of a chance of it happening than not.
yeah.
But still, there's often this idea that talking about it kills the magic. Planning it makes it less satisfying. And I think
Mm,
that's really sad to just stop at that and not to have the curiosity to push a little bit further and see, okay, well,
mm,
how might we still maintain some degree of desire that's not based on infatuation and the honeymoon stage, that's not based on just feeding fantasies in our head and nurturing frustration just to meet again and do the same thing over and over again. Like, and so I would invite people to actively challenge that idea that it cannot be deliberate. It has to be spontaneous and
mm,
just
mm,
happens. You meet the love of your life in the street, and it's just karma and the universe giving you a gift, and then the sex is magical, and then but it's never anything that you do. It happens to you, and when it doesn't happen to you, it's not your fault. There's nothing you can do about it, and you just shake your fist at the sky and wonder why God has put you in horny jail. But no, I think in practice it can be cultivated and very satisfying, but in a deliberate way. But it does require a bare minimum of effort. Yeah.
and that was actually one of the topics I had with our men's group recently, that popped out, is this, like, oh, you don't need to ask for consent because it's very obvious, it just naturally happens. So I think that's one of the problems and the limiting beliefs we have here, is that because there's very few examples of conversationally intelligent and still connective conversations around desire, that people automatically, I did this experiment 3 years ago. I tried this campaign called We Need to Talk,
Mm.
and the we need to talk was literally a neutral we need to talk, like, but in pop literature, in Netflix, in songs, everywhere, when you start looking for that, you'll find that it's always when there's a problem. We need to talk is like, Houston, there's a problem, we need to talk. And people often have this limiting belief that talking about desire kills desire, as you said. But I would say even one stage further, even asking consent, sometimes people associate with actually killing the desire, when in fact it can be a very sexy thing. It can be done in the right tone of voice, with the right timing, with the wink in the eye and a twinkle in the smile, that makes it actually part of the foreplay and not something that kills the vibe. But that's because there aren't any examples of that out there. I mean, you don't see that in pickup books, and you certainly don't see that in porn or in romantic movies, where it's generally all completely glazed over in terms of how the interaction really unfolds.
Yeah, I think we often highlight the damages of porn on sexuality, but we rarely highlight the damages of rom-coms on sexuality. And to me, no, but like for real, they're equally
Yeah.
dangerous in terms of putting completely unrealistic scripts in people's minds. There are generally right now people going around the world thinking it's going to happen like a rom-com and being genuinely disappointed that it doesn't. But it doesn't because you're not actively hallucinating on a heavy amount of drugs. It's normal that it doesn't happen like in a rom-com, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. If your life is too much like a rom-com, there might be something like seriously wrong. It's not necessarily good news.
And I think that's like the romanticization, can you even say that, of sexuality, in the sense that it has to always be in a particular way, like in the rom-coms,
Yeah.
is one of the challenges. So that's why I think the whole levels of connection is interesting, because it gives us a more pragmatic view of, okay, well, how are we connecting? Yes, we have love languages, we have different preferences, but which of these are we actually right now choosing to cultivate? We don't have to connect on all levels, but which ones are we going to cultivate desire through, is really kind of the archetype of the lover. And then I think where it gets really meta is when we open up the last archetype, which is the mastery of the two. But maybe, did you want to add something on the lover archetype, Jonas?
Maybe just again this notion that, you know how we always say that you need to go back, you build on the first level, the yin
Mm,
level for the second level. So you
yeah.
need to have that awareness of yourself in terms of what you actually truly need and want, what genuinely feeds your soul, in
Mm,
order to be able to get it and negotiate it, essentially. Because I think the lover archetype is, in a way, when you're proactively going out into the world and trying to use that energy and embody it and enjoy it. But for that, you need to know, in that kind of contract, what you actually want to get. So again, knowledge of self and honesty with self. I think a lot of problems happen when people feel pressured from the outside. I can think of a patient I had who sent me a message after a session thanking me because I'd helped him to be honest with himself. And it was on this topic of sexuality, and I was helping him to find his moral ground when it came to what was okay or not okay, uh, flirting with a woman that was in a relationship, that was dissatisfied with her relationship, and was kind of actively feeding that connection with him, but
mm,
he was not managing to find his middle ground. So a lot of times we end up uncomfortable in this level because it can be hard being honest with ourselves. So in a way, and I had this with another patient this week, a young woman who was in a situation where she was having intimacy with two men at the same time,
mm,
not being in a monogamous agreement or officially in a relationship with any one of them. And she was asking me, but do you generally think it's okay for me to be having two experiences in parallel? Am I not like being bad or betraying or lying? And when we talked about it, so I just ran her through the script of, how do you feel about it? Does this feel honest with you? Do you feel like you're lying? Is there anything that doesn't sit well with you in that perspective?
mm,
And the only thing that was not sitting well with her was the fear of the future repercussions of this. So basically, just imaginary future consequences. But right now, in practice, she was quite enjoying that situation. And she knew
mm,
that there was
mm,
one that was probably going to turn into more of a relationship, and the other one, it's more a question of just parting. But if she's not honest with herself about what she's really wanting and her boundaries and being selfish enough to just go and get what she actually wants, she would not be able to have a really satisfying situation when it comes to her intimacy at the moment. So just another concrete little example to show that, yeah, first be honest with yourself about what you really want and need, and then you have a much better chance of actually getting it. And maybe it's worth daring to ask, because there might be a lot of people out there who are not necessarily looking for monogamous, stereotypical, long-term relationships.
Mm.
Human sexuality is very diverse and very wild. So chances are there's someone with a similar appetite and taste and that wants to eat the same meals at the same frequency as you, but you just have to have the courage to go out and be like, okay, I want to eat curry every single night. Um, so would you be up for that?
Yeah.
Metaphorically speaking, obviously.
I like the sliding metaphor towards gastronomy. Yeah, it's very nice.
On est français, hein?
Oh, c'est inévitable, inévitable. And then so then, like, if we go to the next one, which is the combination of the first two archetypes, and if you've experienced those, I think most people have experienced those two archetypes in some way, maybe want to experience them more. And then the question of which one do you want to embody more in the present and in the future, from the lover and the seducer, either one of them, when you combine them in a relation to other, and it doesn't have to be a monogamous relation, as we talked about. It could be like a polygamous relation. It could also be any type of relation you choose. When it starts expanding in the sort of what I would call tantric sense, is when the emphasis is on connection, but also personal growth and a wider sense of sensuality. And by sensuality, I mean all 11 senses. I just put there in the background that from the video I did on neuroscience and the senses, that just as a recap, because most people think we have 5 senses, but if we actually look at today's science and knowledge around that, we have obviously 11 senses, if we count the intuitive sense as one, and if we don't, it's 10. So if you take each one of those senses as a playground of connection, it opens up an incredible amount of video game potentials, because, like, for example, balance and position, well, that's clearly dance. You can explore the sensuality of your desire through dance. You can explore it through taste and smell. That's a lot to do with food, or going for walks in nature and so on. So where that relationship takes a different dimension is when it expands from purely sexual in the traditional sense to opening up multiple possibilities of enjoying sensuality of all 11 senses together, and cultivating that sensuality as a playground. I think the word husband is a problem for me. I need to change it in the next version, because it's too close to the idea of husband and wife. This is the old meaning of the archetype translated from French, which husbandry is the sense of stewardship of a long-term relationship. So the main difference between the lover and the husband, or the husband and wife archetype, is that the lover is focused on right now the desire. The husband-wife dynamic is cultivating over time the actual third entity of the relationship. So that's why I drew the heart with 2 heads. It's because there's a new entity that's born. Metaphorically, there is the you, me, and together us. And that is the mastery level, is when you start to cultivate desire and seduction over time in the context of a third level relationship. It's a bit abstract, perhaps. Maybe you have some
So yeah,
concrete.
how would we make the difference between people who are at the lover archetype and people who are at the mastery level in practice? What is the difference between being in a conscious relationship, um, and just having had conversations with your partner and having some kind of a understanding and balance in your relationship? What would the mastery level look like in practice? How is it deeper?
Generally, they have relationship agreements, at least orally, and they understand that the compromise of being together is sometimes meaning that there's a boundary that we both choose to be okay with, like time boundary with children, time boundary with space boundaries, to do with personal hobby space. But I think the main thing is that they're choosing each other. They're not needing each other only. So when a relationship talks, like they say, when, I have a dinner party with a couple of friends and they talk about their relationship and that they're grateful and that they're choosing each other, they're not together because they have to, they're trapped, or that they absolutely need the person, they can't bear to be without them, but there is a natural choicefulness. I think that's generally when you see that they're cultivating it in a way that is mutually harmonious. I don't know, but that's maybe just a small percentage of the relationships.
I think, yeah, that makes sense, and I'm wondering about the spiritual dimension to this, because in my understanding as well, the most advanced level is when you start to verge into that, yeah, holy, sacred territory of the divine masculine dancing with the divine feminine, and embodying that principle of nature that is the most fertile and beautiful thing, which is essentially that pure love and the ability to generate life as well, when those two energies come together, because that happens to be one of the most common side effects of sex as children. So yeah, at the end of the day, there is also this potential spiritual side that we could see to it. And if we look at it in the old school sense of the term, well, obviously you were married in order to then be able to have a family, and you had to be married to have sex in order to have the family, and all of those things just became confused together. But without having to go back to a conservative perspective, I think it's still interesting to consider it in terms of how is the divine principle of nature in me honoring and dancing with the divine principle in my partner, and having that bigger level and seeing it in the kind of grander scheme of things, even though some people don't really like going to that meta level and it just seems wishy-washy spiritual bullshit to them. But if you don't stereotype looking at things in that way, it can be interesting to at least just, yeah, to frame it in that way and to give it that meaning and to look at it in that way, including in times where it gets difficult, because it's not it's normal for every relationship to be challenging sometimes. Like, even a great relationship sometimes is uncomfortable, and requires difficult conversations, and you get triggered, and getting triggered is not a bad sign necessarily in a relationship. If you're looking for a relationship where you don't get triggered, I would advise against being in relationships. So in those moments where it gets challenging, to be able to remember that, okay, I can also choose to look at it as the divine masculine dancing with the divine feminine, and or God playing hide and seek with himself, as Alan Watts would put it, and that it's normal that sometimes it doesn't feel perfect, but sometimes that's necessary in order for it to really feel perfect further down the line. So it can be useful to sometimes reason and frame things at that spiritual level as well. Yeah, at the very least, because it can bring some degree of comfort and meaning to this whole topic, which can be at the same time giving us some of the most beautiful experiences that we live, and also some of the worst pain that we can experience. I think of, heartbreak, betrayal, abandonment, disappointment, all those really deeply unpleasant experiences are often related to that topic as well. So yeah, I think for me, maybe the last level would be really reasoning in that spiritual meta level as well, on top of what you said about having very clear relationship agreements.
And so I think, like, as a reflection question, obviously the idea of talking through these is not just to color them in on the picture and go which ones I've been, which one I am, and which one I want to be embodying in the future, but it's also to do a little bit of self-reflection and self-honesty, as we talked about earlier from your example. That, like, a really powerful question around this is, which senses do I want to explore with my partner? It sounds like a weird question to ask, but we get trapped into overstimulating the visual sense, screens, pictures, paying attention to our partner's look and the way they look. Like, play around a game is like, okay, I'd like to explore sense of smell with my partner. Okay, well, let's go out and buy a perfume together, and let's go and sniff some flowers in the forest, and just enjoy the smell of the fresh air together while we go for a walk. That can be a very beautiful way of connecting. That's quite mundane, quite maybe small, but in practice can be a really beautiful moment of connection. And so my reflection question to you, if you're listening to this, is like, which senses am I consciously choosing to share with my partner right now? Am I just restricting myself to one or two senses because that's my go-to? If I'm very erotically turned on by pictures, then I'm always in the visual sense. Or can I expand my experience of connection to kinetic, like I'm doing at the moment with Anna? We go in dancing a lot. It's not always comfortable, but it creates a completely different type of connection by body mirroring in dance movements and stuff like that, which is completely new in some ways. And I think that's where the Tantra comes back, is that the sacred practice for this path, or the practice that helps this path move further forward, is I don't mean Tantra in only the Indian sense. A lot of people associate Tantra with India. There's different forms of Tantra around the world. There's African Tantra. There's basically echoes of Tantra in most civilization. They just call it differently. But if you were to take the essence of it, it's the art of connecting on multiple levels than just the physical. So it can be a spiritual connection, it can be the 8 types of connection we talked about, or it can be construed in any other way where there is a component of selfless connection, which is spiritual as well as a physical. And so practicing that is, for some people, literally the crowning of their life, the whole life purpose. And that life path can be, for some, the entire life unfolding for them, is the desire to sort of seduce, find the right love, and happily ever after get married into a perfect relationship. For some people, that is their life path, ambition, and fulfillment. But I'm inviting us to think of Tantra in a more wide way than just the romantic love of a couple, but thinking of it as, how do I connect with other human beings in any way? So that's the archetypes of the husband, wife, the lover, the seducer, on the path of sexuality. Now, Jonas, what have we forgotten?
What have we forgotten? That is a good question.
I think we've forgotten to take this lightly, because it's a very heavy topic. And it's a topic that's so easy to just... I was just talking to a friend yesterday about what's the main cultural difference between Finland and France. It's that jokes in France are very often, even in small talk with strangers, around sexuality.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas in Finland, that is highly inappropriate. Culturally, it would be in a workplace particularly really wrong, politically incorrect in most other places. So I think, like, the laughter, I think, is what is hard to bring into this topic, and the playfulness, because it triggers people so easily when you start laughing at sexuality. Obviously, you're better placed than me as a therapist to know why that is, but maybe that's the one thing. Like, should we share something a bit French culture-y on that? How would you...
Oh, I have the perfect anecdote. Okay. So this happened last year. I went to a pizza truck next to where I live. Like, there's a roundabout, there's a pizza truck. Like, it's a very common thing in France, right? And the guy that was making the pizzas, massive bloke, he was chatting with some other people that were standing there, and one of his friends who was doing the deliveries. And he was telling the story about how he was having to hide in the cupboard from this woman who he was shagging when her husband came home, and how he was having an existential crisis in that cupboard, thinking to himself, I own my business, I'm 30-something years old, I'm a grown-ass man, what am I doing hiding in this fucking cupboard right now? And he was telling this while I like, context, I did not know this man, and he was making me part of the conversation while he was making my pizza, and we were joking about it, and yeah, we were just like, and it turned into a conversation and banter where it got quite deep on reflections of the meaning of life, and the relationship to truth and to deceit and to all of those things. And this was just buying a pizza. So just to illustrate how in France, yeah, indeed, sex is not the same kind of topic, and how it can show up very randomly in those type of situations. But that was, yeah, a funny situation. And the way this, I can't emphasize how huge this guy was. Like, more than 6 foot tall, built like a rugby player that had finished his rugby career and now just purely pursued his passion for beer. Like, I'm talking like grizzly bear guy. And just to imagine this guy hiding in this poor woman's closet like that, and yeah, it was just that'll stick with me for a long time, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a great illustration of how culture talks about that path differently in different countries. Thank you, Jonas. Next time we'll be talking about another path, but just some closing words you were going to say?
No, I was going to say, what do you think that conversation would have looked like in Finland then, if we had to contrast?
There wouldn't have been any talk of sex. It would have been about the weather and how winter is coming, and how it's cold. most likely. If there would have been small talk, which is less likely than there would have been a silence while waiting for the credit card to cash the money, and awkward silence while waiting for the receipt to be handed over. That's probably most likely what would have happened. But yes, I think we could open up that topic again and again, but I think we should do a separate feature where, as we talked about offline, maybe we could do a few sort of series of you interviewing me around that path, around the ethnography that I've done on these different sex bubbles, and understanding how people are thinking, the rules of consent they use, and this kind of thing. That could be a topic of another season if we do. If anybody's particularly interested, add it in the comments below. We can pick up any topics or questions that you find interesting. Meanwhile, Jonas, thank you for today again, for taking some time to have this conversation, and enjoy your climbing or gardening this afternoon.
Climbing this afternoon. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you very much. Thank